Tracy, if you want to go out in the hallway, invite everyone to come in. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our next session. This is the USCIRF Victims List, updates on countries and cases. We're going to welcome Ms. Keely Bakken for our moderator, please.
Everyone, okay, great. All right, hi everyone. Thanks for coming to our session today. We'll be talking about USCIRF's victims list. My name is Keely Bakken. I'm a supervisory policy analyst at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF for short. USCIRF was formed by an act of Congress about 25 years ago to monitor and document religious freedom conditions abroad. We also make policy recommendations to the U.S. government, inclusive of the White House, the State Department, and Congress on ways to improve religious freedom. Our commission is composed of 9 commissioners, which are appointed by a combination of the president and the leadership of both parties in the House and the Senate, and also has a nonpartisan professional staff, of which we are a couple of the members. Today we'll be talking about religious prisoners, which is a subject that USCIRF has done a lot of work on over the years. We have reported on them regularly in our annual report that's released every year by May. We've also included them, highlighted their cases in ad hoc reporting that we put out year-round as well. I did want to make just one quick plug for a special report we had done on religious prisoners in Uzbekistan just a little over a year ago, where we found that that country continues to detain up to 2,000 Muslims. But today we'll be talking about more trends that we've seen in specific countries over the last year or so. And so just to introduce our panelists and my colleagues really quickly, today we have speaking Dylan Schexnayder, a researcher focused on Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, and also the administrator for USCIRF's For Victims list. Scott Wiener, supervisory policy analyst focused on the Arabian Peninsula and Iran, but also overseeing a team working on the broader Middle East and Africa. And Kurt Werthmuller, another supervisory policy analyst who oversees the Commission's work on East and Southeast Asia. And so with that, I will turn it over to Dylan to start.
Thank you, Keely. Welcome, everyone. Last year, we wound up doing this similar PowerPoint. We wound up talking a lot about the congressional mandate and a lot of details related to the background. But this year, we're just going to dive straight into the data. First and foremost, I'll say this is our Freedom of Religion or Belief Victims List. It is essentially a database where we monitor and document people who are targeted on the basis of their religion or belief, or virtually several other religious freedom dimension elements. So over the last year, we've added over 600 people to our database. And for our next step, I'm just going to show us how the breakdown of the data works. There are 1,952 prisoners at the end of the year. And this is where the victims skew. So most of the people in the database are from China. 39% of our victims are from there. 19% Russia, 15% Iran, 4% Pakistan, 4% Uzbekistan, 4% Vietnam, 3% India, 3% Eritrea, 2% Saudi Arabia. And then every other country we monitor makes up less than 1%, so we've kind of just grouped them all together into an other. Yeah. We'd be more than happy to talk about each country and why we have so many. Of course, Kurt will be speaking more about China later. When it comes to religion, as you can see, there is a wide diversity based off of various religious demographics. Sunni Muslim, 15%, Church of Almighty God, 12%, Jehovah's Witness, 12%, Falun Gong, 11%, Baha'i, 7%, Protestant 6%, Buddhist 6%, Sufi 3%, and then various other denominations of Muslims and Christians and just unspecified or unknown groups. These could be Yarsanis, these could be atheists, but because the database doesn't splice down as neatly, we've decided to just have them in this format for us. Every country is different, and each country is unique in how they persecute specific groups. So again, we're going to be more than happy to talk about each of those and any questions you may have later. One of the more interesting things we've been able to institute over the last year was looking at the charges that people are charged with. And this is important because, every country uses different legal pretexts to target religious groups and political prisoners in general. The vast majority of people, we actually don't know what their charges are, and this stems primarily from China, where we see the large detention and incarceration of Uyghur Muslims. We just don't have enough information on whether or not they are charged or not. Similarly, other groups like the Falun Gong, we just don't have enough information, although we probably do have suspicions of what they are charged with. Other charges that we do see, we've labeled as banned organization. They're accused of being an extremist organization or a gang or a terrorist organization. 16% cult, 14% terrorism, 13% extremism, 10% treason and sedition, 8% spreading propaganda or misinformation, 6% illegal assembly, 6% hate speech, 5% blasphemy, and there are several other charges that we could talk about here, but don't make up as large of a concentrated percentage. So, yeah. And one thing I do want to emphasize is that we are talking about very, very serious charges. These are allegations of violence, but to be clear, these are allegations. We look into these cases. We try to determine if there was a real threat of violence, if these individuals have used, and USCIRF has determined that these prisoners have not engaged in any serious or substantiated claims of violence. And so I really want to make that clear. Now, I mentioned earlier we added over 600 people, and this really has stemmed from two specific countries in which we saw a very large crackdown. In Iran, we had almost an increase of 180 victims this year. This primarily has to do with large repression of Baha'is, Yarsanis, and protesters in relation to the Mahsa Amini protests in Iran. And Scott will be able to dive more into those details later. Another country where we saw very big repression, almost 180 victims as well, in Russia. And the three major groups that were targeted during these times were Crimean Tatar Muslims. We saw large groups of Muslims accused of terrorism for regularly peaceful activity, sentenced to decades in prison. Likewise, Jehovah's Witnesses. There are currently over 100 Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia, in prison or state custody for their religious activity. And likewise, with the conflict in Ukraine, we've seen Russian military forces targeting specifically religious leaders. And this has been an effort to try to exert control and influence over the local population. Additionally, we do a couple of thematic themes or thematic issues. Blasphemy is one that is very common for our database. These are some of the major updates. 69% of our people in our database charged with blasphemy are from Pakistan, 11% Iran, 5% Algeria, 5% Indonesia, and so on and so forth. The individuals here in Pakistan, Ashfaq Masih, Amun Ayub, Shehzad Masih, Zafar Bhatti, Wasim Abbas, Anika Atik, all of these individuals were sentenced to death last year for blasphemy specifically, and Notan Law was sentenced to life imprisonment for blasphemy. Additionally, in Nigeria, this individual, Abdul Jabbar Naziru Kabara, he was sentenced to death in Nigeria for blasphemy. This happened just now in December. And as well as Mubarak Bala, a very high-profile case, was sentenced to 24 years in prison last year. So very disheartening developments in that front. Additionally, would like to go over a couple of specific cases that our analysts were interested in mentioning today. We do have the case of Bishop Rolando Alvarez. This is in Nicaragua. Outspoken critic of the government for its human rights abuses as well as its targeting of the Catholic Church. He was recently put under house arrest in 2022. He is facing conspiracy and spreading false news charges. We've seen a growing crackdown in Nicaragua of Catholic clergy and other institutions related to the Catholic Church. In Saudi Arabia, we've seen very large sentences doled out to religious dissidents. This one was particularly egregious. In 2022, Selma al-Shahab was sentenced to 34 years in prison. She is also under a 34-year travel ban related to tweets in support of women's rights defenders, people protesting against Saudi Arabia's guardianship system that particularly targets women on the basis of religion or the state's interpretation of religion. And so she was charged for those tweets, terrorism, and spreading false information. Additionally, Shamil Kakimov from Tajikistan, he has been in prison since 2019, but unfortunately his case continues to come up again and again because the government fails to give him proper medical care. Absolutely horrid conditions. He is expected to be released next year, but our contacts tell us that they are very concerned that he may not make it out alive. He was sentenced to 7 years and 6 months originally for quote unquote inciting religious hatred. This primarily has to do with authorities accusing him of leading his Jehovah's Witness community. And last, for our individual spotlight panel, for my sake, we have Donera Perez Pasiero. She is from Cuba. She is a Yoruba leader targeted because of her religious leadership role. She came out in support of the July protests. And unfortunately, recently we've learned that she may have been sentenced to 8 years in prison for several unsubstantiated charges relating to her protesting and the targeting of her specific religious community. There have also been reports that authorities in prison have tried to leverage her religious belief to her release, pressuring her to say, you know, if you give up your religious leadership role in your religion, we'll let you go free. And she still has not been released, so assuming that she has not given that up. Thank you all, and I'll leave it to Keely.
Thank you, Dylan, for that overview. And with that, actually, I will be turning it over to Scott to speak specifically on Iran and some other cases.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. So I'll speak a little bit about cases in Iran and a little about Saudi Arabia as well. But the trends that I'll highlight are really generalizable to the global situation for religious prisoners. In Saudi Arabia, as Dylan mentioned, we've seen a concerning trend of egregiously long sentences for peaceful speech. Now, in the wake of COVID-19, in-person association sort of came down and people moved online for their association. The flip side of that was that it made it easier for governments to track speech that they considered to be against their interpretation of given religions. So because it's easier to track and monitor, we've seen a concerning trend of people who are religious dissidents peacefully expressing their views, but being arrested and charged and thrown in prison as a result. Saudi Arabia also continues to litigate cases from the 2011 protests in the majority Shia Eastern province. Several of those who were charged were minors at the time that they are alleged to have committed crimes. There are also cases of minors who've been executed from this community. Now, some who have originally been under a death sentence had their sentences converted to life in prison and were eventually released, but many cases continue to be prosecuted. We're also concerned for women human rights defenders and those who stand up for them. So as Dylan mentioned, the 34-year sentence was not necessarily for speech, but supporting someone else's speech. That's a thing we've seen in Iran as well, where people who've supported women advocating for their freedom of religion or belief have themselves been persecuted. Lawyers like Nasruddin Sotoudeh, for example. And finally, we're concerned with a case we've tracked for a long time, but the case of Raif Badawi, who served 10 years in prison, originally under a death sentence and sentenced to several hundred whiplashes. He was released last year at the end of his sentence, but remains under a travel ban. His family, his wife and kids have grown up in Canada without him. And we've been calling on the government of Saudi Arabia to allow him to join his family after these 10 years in which he was in prison. He was denied medical care, he had gone on hunger strikes, and this is over blog posts that he had written gently criticizing Islam and the Saudi government. So this is truly an embarrassment for freedom of religion or belief, and we think it's in everyone's interest to bring this chapter to a close. In Iran, we see a theme of control and confidence in the government being threatened. When that happens, it's often religious minorities who are targeted. The persecution of religious minorities was egregious in Iran even before the outbreak of protests in September of last year. In the wake of those protests, we've seen a number of really concerning cases emerge. There's been a very serious uptick in arrests of Baha'is, including two former leaders of the community named Fariba Kamalabadi and Mervesh Sabet, members of the Irani Iran. They've already served 10 years in prison for their leadership of the community and are now sentenced to an additional 10 years in prison. Members of the Gambari Sufi community, including Hamed Ghar Hassan Lu, have been sentenced to death, although we've heard some reports that may be changed. His wife, Farzaneh, has been sentenced to 25 years in prison. This is for attending the 40-day anniversary of the killing of a protester against Iran's mandatory hijab laws, which deny individual women their freedom of religion or belief. Members of Iran's LGBTQI community also continue to be persecuted, including 2 women named Sarah and Elham, who are under a death sentence for their support of that community. And we're deeply concerned by the systematic and ongoing harassment, assault, and rape of women in prison and girls as well, people under the age of 18. As Commissioner Kleinbaum mentioned at our town hall yesterday, this is not a result of lax enforcement or poor training. This is a deliberate strategy by the government of Iran targeting prisoners in an attempt to silence and shame them when they peacefully advocate for freedom of religion or belief. When we see these kinds of egregious violations happening to prisoners, it can be disheartening, and it's often difficult to know what the United States can do. Luckily, our mandate as USCIRF is to make recommendations, and we can talk about those specifically in the question and answer session. But really what it comes back to is lifting the veil of impunity that prison officials and members of court systems have when it comes to the treatment of prisoners. When people feel that they can act without accountability and with impunity, it allows the kinds of violations that we see to increase. So for the United States and for our partners in the International Religious Freedom of Belief Alliance and other partner and ally governments, to put a spotlight on these cases, to say we know this is happening and we intend to hold you accountable, is a really critical step that we can take on behalf of many of these prisoners detained on the basis of their religious beliefs.
Thank you, Scott. And then now to Kurt to talk about East and Southeast Asia.
Thank you, Keely. Appreciate that. Thank you, Scott and Dylan. First of all, before I talk about a number of specific cases, and that's really what I do want to emphasize in my time this morning, several individual cases. As the supervisor of the East and Southeast Asia team, I went to my team last week and said, what are some of the key cases that we can talk about that you would like me to really emphasize as illustrative of some of the issues in East and Southeast Asia? And I'm sad to say that the list kept growing. So I do have a number of people that I want to make sure to mention. Before I get into some of the broader issues, I do want to recognize that today is the 2-year anniversary of the military coup in Burma, also referred to as Myanmar, of course. And that means that the military that perpetrated the genocidal actions against the Rohingya people, and as I'll come to in a couple of minutes, lots of other people as well, has been in power pulling the strings of the country for the last 2 years. And this, of course, is a tragic reality. I was part of a USCIRF commission along with my colleague Patrick Greenwald and Commissioner Stephen Schneck to Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh in November to visit the Rohingya refugees. And on one hand, it was humbling to see the incredible work that lots of people from lots of countries are doing to help out the community. And at the same time, of course, deeply, deeply disheartening to see the conditions and the lack of hope, frankly, that so many of these refugees have to live in. And that is a result of this same military going back, of course, earlier years, but that is now in power. So I want to recognize that. On that note, case in point, I'll mention one prisoner, and that is Hakalam Sampson, who was just arrested a few months ago in December. He's actually a Baptist pastor from the Kachin minority in Burma. The reason that I note his case here, of course he remains in prison, is we've spent as a commission a lot of time, and rightly so, looking at the absolute massive crisis facing the Rohingya community, and we will continue to do that. We will not forget. But it's also important to note that the Burmese government, the military government, the junta, has been absolutely ruthless to all sorts of people, and they've done what they can to commit genocide against the Rohingya, and they've been turning to lots of other peoples and communities as well, religious and ethnic minorities. So I want to make sure to highlight that case up front as illustrative of the situation in Burma. But I also want to note, now turning to a number of other countries, as we look across East and Southeast Asia, we have a lot of people that frankly have been on our various lists, of victims lists, and for a while before that, the Religious Prisoners of Conscience Project, and just general reporting for some years. In some cases, several years. In some cases, even before USCIRF existed, going back several decades. And I want to note these cases as we go through them because it's really important for us as a commission to note that we don't forget. You know, sometimes we'll see names that might be a little bit quieter in terms of our reporting. Very often that's a matter of discretion out of respect for concerns from their family or concerns for an individual's safety. But I do want to assure you that for these names and these people that we report on, we don't forget, and we will continue to remember, and we will continue to advocate for them regardless of how many years they've been on these lists for us, sometimes publicly and sometimes privately, but we won't forget. So on that note, you know, as Dylan mentioned before, the numbers, the sheer numbers out of China in terms of victims of religious persecution are, again, staggering. They're daunting. And we can see in some of the cases a real clear illustration of how broadly that religious repression is in China. We've been reporting really since the beginning of USCIRF the detention of the 11th Panchen Lama, of course, from the Tibetan Buddhist community. He was detained, abducted, as a 6-year-old child in 1995 and remains under the thumb of the communist regime in China. We have Habibullah Toti, who's, of course, a Uyghur Muslim, who was detained in March 2017 as part of the broader genocidal crackdown against the Uyghur Muslim community in Xinjiang. And he has remained in detention until that time. We also have Pastor Wang Yi of the Early Rain Covenant Church in Chengdu, who was arrested along with hundreds of his congregants in his Protestant Christian community. He was sentenced to 9 years in prison for, and I'm quoting the charges here, inciting subversion of state power and illegal business activity. So, you know, these are different communities: Tibetan Buddhists, Uyghur Muslims, Protestant Christians. We could continue on for an hour just listing the names in the different communities that China has cracked down on. I want to shift to North Korea. This is a rather challenging one for us in terms of the victims list and for all of our reporting because, of course, North Korea is a bit of a reporting black hole because of the absolute ruthless repression of communication, of media, of any contacts with the outside world. It's very difficult to get documentation on violations and on individual cases in North Korean context. And yet we do get some from time to time. One of those is Chang Wenxi, who is actually a Chinese national and a Christian deacon who North Korea abducted from over the border in China, took him back into North Korea in 2014 because he was ministering to North Korean people who had fled over the border to find refuge in China, of all places. That tells you how bad things are in North Korea if they were seeking refuge in China. And he was sentenced at some point, we don't have really clear specifics, to 15 years for, and I'll quote the sort of typical North Korean charges here, defaming the regime, attempting to incite subversion of state power, providing aid and gospel to North Koreans. 3 more cases to note, and then I'll turn things back over here. One is in Vietnam, continuing around Southeast Asia. Of course, this is a country with long-standing religious freedom violations that USCIRF has reported on for a long time, had been making some slow but noteworthy improvements over the last decade or so. But in the last year or two, we've started to see some concerning signs of decline, especially, but not limited to, rural areas. But in 2017, Nguyen Buc Truan, who was a lawyer and leader of the Vietnamese Political and Religious Prisoner Friendship Association, did a lot of advocacy for the Hau Hau Buddhist community in particular, and therefore he was an advocate for victims of FORB violations. He was arrested in July 2017, became a victim himself, and the following year was sentenced to 11 years in prison for, quote, carrying out activities aimed at overthrowing the People's Administration. And he is still held in prison 5 years later, despite serious medical issues, and frankly, despite the Vietnamese government's claims that things are fine, religious freedom is resolved, it's in good shape in the country, and yet he remains in prison. Finally, I'll conclude with two cases in Malaysia that are especially dear to USCIRF's heart collectively, because we've reported on them for several years, and because their cases remain so disturbing, and as you'll see, they are inextricably linked in terms of the circumstances and most likely the perpetrators. That is Pastor Raymond Ko, who was abducted in February 2017, and Amri Che Mat, who was abducted just a few months prior in November 2016. Pastor Raymond Ko, of course, is a Protestant Christian pastor. Amri Che Mat is a convert to Shia Islam. And in both cases, these individuals were out in the street. They were surrounded by black SUVs, blindfolded, and then disappeared, literally never to be heard from again. In 2019, Suhakam, which is Malaysia's Independent Commission for Human Rights, they determined that a so-called special branch of the Malaysian police had targeted and abducted these two individuals for their religious activities. And shortly thereafter, later in 2019, the Malaysian government launched an investigation, but here's the catch. They finished their investigation. They said that they produced a report, but refused to release it publicly for national security concerns. And we just met a few months ago with Raymond Ko's wife, Susanna, who's an incredibly strong and courageous woman, and she has actually filed a lawsuit against the Malaysian government to force them to release that report, so the truth of what happened to her husband, Pastor Raymond Ko, and in a parallel report, Amri Che Mat, can be brought to light and brought to the public. So those are just a few examples from East and Southeast Asia to illustrate the breadth and, I should say, the depth as well of our reporting on these victims. Keely, back to you.
Well, thanks everyone for those great presentations. I think I will just open with a question of my own really quick, and then we can see if we have questions from the audience. But my question is, this database is a great resource. How can people use it? And I want to ask that first to Dylan in terms of how can people submit information to the database. But I also want to make sure that there's the opportunity for Scott and Kurt to answer this as well in terms of in what ways can this database be used for advocacy?
Thank you, Keely. The first thing I do want to caveat is say, our database does not document every single case of imprisonment and detention. We receive information from NGOs and from our partners on the ground, and they are the ones feeding us the information. So if you have information, we would love to have it. We would love to know of it. And one way you can do that is on our website. There is a intake form where you can go to our database, click at the bottom of the screen, and then submit the name of an individual you think meets the requirements for database inclusion. Likewise, I'll be around after this event. Feel free to take my business card. Feel free to email me if you know of any information in particular. Our staff is, I'm not a regional specialist on several of these places, but our staff is monitoring these cases and can say a lot about those. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'll say on that note as well that, well, Keely didn't offer remarks today. She is an unbelievable expert on Russia and Central Asia. And so if those are cases of interest to you, then please do speak with her. Dylan has also done an incredible job at filling this database almost single-handedly. And so a lot of the results you saw reflected today are largely the result of his tireless efforts. This is a database that is hosted by the US government that carries a lot of weight internationally. And so we want to be able to help you by hosting this information and by showing that these are real cases that the US government is watching and taking seriously. And we hope that by doing that, we're able to magnify the impact that all of our partners in the NGO community can have as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll reiterate a couple of those points as well. We rely on civil society for the database, and so if you and your communities and countries that you cover, you look at the database and say, this looks like my community that I'm concerned with is underrepresented here. Help us out, please. As Dylan mentioned, go to the website and look for that button to submit. Send us documentation, send us cases. I was just thinking this morning, I mentioned Burma. I was sitting in on the really amazing panel of young people who are advocates for their community in Burma, in Myanmar. And I was thinking as I was listening to their cases, I really hope that we get some of their cases, because clearly they know a lot more than we do about